I want to start by asking you all to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And I want us to do a little bit of time travel. I want us to start this talk in the future. And with credit to one of my mentors and teachers, Akaya Winwood, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and imagine a child that you know and love. See that child's face. And now imagine that child's child in the future. Hold their face in your mind and imagine them alive in a thriving future. Imagine this child having everything that they need. And in your mind, pan out and take in, what is this thriving future? What do you see? Look around. What does this future look like? How are people living in relationship with each other, in relationship with the planet? And let's take a breath. And when you're ready, open your eyes. I know that each and every one of you is working towards that future. And I partly want us to start there because this moment that we are living in right now, it's a really challenging moment. It's a really tough moment. I know, I'm looking at all of you, I know many of you have worked in the nonprofit sector for many, many years. I have too, and I can't think of a moment that's been as challenging as this one. And so sometimes it's hard to remember what it is that we all are working towards. I wanted to start in that future because, I'm on this stage because I wrote this book, A New Era of Philanthropy, and I wrote this book to really try to understand what will it take for the $2 trillion that currently in this moment exist in the philanthropic sector. $2 trillion. And that our sector, the philanthropic sector, is anticipated to grow by another $11.9 trillion in the next 20 years. As somebody who has worked in philanthropy for 20 years, I felt the need to sort of step back and really understand what can we do to ensure that these resources actually take us to that future, right? That future where our descendants are all thriving. So thank you for going with me there. And I invite you in moments that feel difficult in this work, I invite you just to really center in the future that we're all trying to build. Because the work that you do, it is going to take us there, and it's so important. It's always been important, but right now it's really important. So I want to try to do 3 things today in this talk, in addition to the time travel. So my hope is that you come away from this conversation having a deeper understanding about the history of philanthropy and sort of the hidden blueprint, and and sort of what it is that's gotten us to this moment. I want to share with you all what I call the new era that we are beginning to build and need to build. And then I want to talk to you about your role as fundraisers in building this new era and the ways that you can show up in your work that will move us towards a philanthropy that will actually unlock these resources that we really need right now. So those are kind of my goals. And I will just say that I traveled here with a bunch of books. And so after my talk, I will be at a table out there. And I'm selling books and signing books. And so I invite you to come over and grab a book, maybe grab one for your favorite funder. And I'd love to sign it and I'd love to meet you. So we started by kind of taking a glimpse of the future. And, as I said, I wrote this book because I was trying to understand those of us who are moving resources, how do we make sure we get to that future? But now I'm going to invite you to come with me to the past. Because for me, the sort of surprise of writing this book is that I got to my central thesis of the book by actually looking at the past. When I set out to understand what philanthropy needs to do, my plan was just to really look around at my peers and those of us that were trying to reimagine the work of philanthropy, those of us who were advocating for and putting into motion trust-based practices and practices that share power with grantees. And I was about 3-4 months into writing this book when I went on a family vacation to Pacific Grove, California, and I stole a few hours away from the family to go and put in time on this book. And I went to the public library in Pacific Grove. For those who don't know, Pacific Grove is this small, quaint seaside town in California. And I went to the public library, was working on my laptop, and when I was done with my writing session, I wrapped up my stuff and looked up, and there on the wall in front of me was a portrait of Andrew Carnegie. And for those who don't know, Andrew Carnegie is often referred to as the father of modern philanthropy. So here it was, 2024, and I'm in this public library, and here's Andrew. And at the moment, when that happened, I didn't think that much of it, except, I think he wrote about philanthropy. And here I am trying to write about philanthropy. And it seemed sort of funny to me. And as I was getting ready to leave, I just took a selfie of myself next to this portrait. And then I got home and I looked at it, and all of a sudden I had all of these questions. First I just thought, what is this doing here in 2024? And it vaguely reminded me of how when I have to take my kid to the hospital, it's not the children's hospital, it's the Mark Benioff Children's Hospital. So it's in some ways it was this reminder of just the huge amount of space that donors and their gifts take in our kind of civic culture, right? But it really piqued my curiosity. And so I realized that, I actually didn't know that much about Andrew Carnegie. And I didn't, even as a practitioner of philanthropy, I actually didn't know that much about kind of how we got from what he put into motion to where we are today. So I started going down these rabbit holes. In the book, you'll read a lot about the libraries. I'll just share one quick thing about the libraries. He's known as the patron saint of libraries. And when I started to really read about the libraries, it became clear he's known as that because he wanted to be remembered as a patron and as a saint. But in his lifetime, it's like, why do we know him as the patron saint? Because that's how he wanted to be known. But in his lifetime, Andrew Carnegie was not thought of as a saint. In his lifetime, he was a uniquely wealthy person, right? In his time, he had amassed an amount of wealth that really no one else had up until that time. And he had done so through some really exploitative labor practices. When he was alive, he signed off on one of the most violent labor actions, crushing unions, crushing workers who were trying to ask for a living wage. And so when he was alive and he was out there sort of saying, I want to build you a library, there were actually cities in this country that said, absolutely not, right? I found this Harper's Weekly magazine from 1906 that has this incredible cartoon on the cover where it shows this kind of huge cartoonish Andrew Carnegie as if he's like a big child and he's putting these building blocks, and each of the blocks is a library, and he's building this wall of libraries, and behind the wall is, sort of a world on fire. It's his steel mills, smoke, police, it's chaos, but he's trying to hide all of it with his libraries. I found out that he wrote a book, an actual book, that had all the specifications of how the libraries had to be built. Because it wasn't just that he gave money to cities to build libraries. He signed off on the location. He signed off on the design. He had his own design specifications. So for example, every one of his libraries had to have these sweeping sort of staircases that went up because he felt like that showed the elevation of the human condition through reading. And when community members said, well, if we build these staircases, the library won't be accessible to elderly community members, to disabled community members, his response was, you either build a library in the ways that I have laid out in my book, or you don't get the funding. We call him the patron saint of libraries, but he never paid for a single book in our libraries. He actually didn't pay for any of the people who work in our libraries. And in fact, in many places in this country, local taxes first came about to pay for Carnegie's libraries. It turns out that the reason that that painting is hanging there is that on what would have been Carnegie's 100th birthday, the Carnegie Foundation mailed out the paintings to every library that he had funded. When Carnegie built his library in Atlanta, a full 30% of the people who lived in the city of Atlanta could not use the library because it was a segregated, white-only library. I have the chance to talk to a lot of donors and funders, and I always share that piece of information to help people understand something that is fundamentally true, which is that philanthropy is always an act of power. And we either use that power to challenge the power structures, or we amplify them. When he built libraries in the segregated South and agreed to have them be for whites only, he amplified the existing inequalities. He supercharged them. In the same way that funders today, if they are funding without contending with power, it's not neutral. They are amplifying the existing inequalities. So after I went down all the library rabbit holes, I had this realization that I had worked in the sector for almost 20 years and had actually never read the thing that Andrew Carnegie is most known for, and that is the Gospel of Wealth. And I hadn't read it for two reasons. So one is that I didn't think it was for me. I sort of thought of the Gospel of Wealth as being a man of wealth writing to other men of wealth. And that is what it was. But also I didn't read it because I thought I knew what it said in the way that we often think we know what historical documents say, right? So I sort of thought like, oh, that's that, that letter that was written by the wealthy guy saying that if you're wealthy, you have a responsibility and obligation to give to others. But all this time that I was spending with Andrew learning about his libraries piqued my curiosity. And so I sat down to read the Gospel of Wealth. And I'm going to share with you all some highlights, things that I feel like we should know. There's a much more entertaining version of this in the book where, I share Andrew's Gospel of Wealth, but I share it in the format of a podcast conversation where Andrew comes onto my podcast and everything he says is from the Gospel of Wealth. He starts off the Gospel of Wealth, talking about the times that he lives in. And it really mirrors the times that we live in today, right? He starts off saying, I know that this new economic order that we are living with, where a few people have all the resources and most people are struggling to get by, I know it's hard. So he's very clear-eyed. He's like, I know this is difficult. I know it's a time of struggle and suffering. But then he goes on to say, but it's the law of civilization, meaning that this new economic arrangement, which in his time there was a lot of pushback on, he says, it's not up for debate. It's the law of civilization. And so right there enshrined in kind of the beginning of philanthropy is this deep commitment to a type of extreme inequality. And I think that's really important from today's vantage point for us to know and for us to contend with. He goes on to say, I know you're struggling. I know people are struggling, but I have this great idea. You can trust us. We're going to take care of you. We're going to do this thing called philanthropy. And so the paternalism that exists in philanthropy, it's right there. It just comes straight. It leaps off the page, not as if it was something that was written 140 years ago, but as if it's something that's embodied today. He goes on to say, not only are we going to take care of you, we're going to do better things with this money than you would have done yourself had it come to you in, and this is a quote, small sums. Any guess what he means by small sums? Wages. So this idea that philanthropy is a justification for exploitation, for economic inequality, right? And this notion that I'm sure you all as fundraisers will not find new, that billionaires know best. Have you seen that in your work? Yeah. I mean, I have, as somebody who's worked in foundations, this idea that we know something by virtue of having the resources. The most important thing that I took away from the Gospel of Wealth, and this is what really has formed the thesis of this book, is that Carnegie was really clear about the purpose of philanthropy. He says in the Gospel of Wealth that we are here to do a little bit of good, and that's a quote, a little bit of good, but to not disturb the roots of the systems. And by systems, what he is talking about is the systems that shape who has power and wealth, right? Today, the philanthropic sector gives on average 5% of their overall capital to efforts to promote social change. And then the other 95% of their capital, all of which is earmarked for the public interest, that other 95% is invested usually in the stock market and almost always in the status quo. The philanthropy that Carnegie gave birth to, as the father of philanthropy, is what I call in my book a gilded philanthropy. That term, Gilded Age, which is often used to describe the time that he was alive, that term comes to us from Mark Twain. And he coined that phrase because to gild something is to cover it over with a thin sheath of gold, right? And he was saying, this time seems like a time of lots of wealth and prosperity, but really it's just like covering over something that underneath is hollow or corrupt. And so in my book, I talk about how this philanthropy that he put into motion is not actually trying to change things. It's trying to cover over, right? Just to mask systems that are harmful, systems that are inequitable. That's the gilded philanthropy, and it didn't just stop with Carnegie, but it's actually what is behind the walls in so many philanthropic institutions today. And so the call in my book is for us to really say that we have reached kind of the end of this 140-year-long era of gilded philanthropy, and that for us to meet today's challenges, we need a new era that is not about preservation of these harmful systems, but that's actually about transformation. So my book basically calls for philanthropy to have a new purpose, and then looks at how do we do our philanthropic practice with that as our purpose. So I appreciate you all for taking that trip into the past with me. And now we're going to come into the present and talk about this moment. So part of what inspired this question and part of what inspired me to write this book is that the present times that we live in are really times of polycrisis. And by polycrisis, what I'm referring to is the fact that it's been about a decade since any of us have had the luxury of dealing with just one big crisis at a time, right? Pretty much for the last decade, we've been dealing with increasing climate catastrophe, deepening inequality, and attacks on democracy that we might be experiencing here domestically, but that are global. It's a phenomenon that's beyond our borders, and each of these crises impact the other. And this was one of the things that, made me say, like, we've actually got to take a step back and ask, how can philanthropy meet this moment? Because for the most part, we're failing to. And that assessment of like we're failing to, I think wasn't, it's not just like my own feeling. There was a period where before I started writing the book, I had just wrapped up a little bit over 7 years of tenure running a private foundation. And, I took a sabbatical for a few months and was planning to basically get back on the market and look for a similar role at a larger institution. And every time I thought about doing that, I would have this like nagging question of, but do I believe that philanthropy can meet the moment? And I thought it was just me. And I thought, oh, is this what burnout looks like? But I often get asked to come and speak to rooms of funders. And so I started doing this thing where at the beginning of my talks, I would ask people to close their eyes and raise their hand if they believed that philanthropy could meet the moment. And it was astounding. In room after room, I did not see a single hand go up. I saw this pattern where a few people would go like this, and it was always my peer CEOs. And I was amazed because their whole team would be there with their hands down. So I realized, that was in part what inspired me to write this book, is that I realized, this sense that the way that we are attending to the distribution of these resources, like it's broken and people know it's broken. So the poly crisis, these big dynamics of democracy, climate, inequality, these are all challenges that at their heart are about power and how resources and wealth are distributed. So a philanthropy that is not trying to change that, but that is essentially saying we're going to preserve these systems, is not going to be able to meet that moment, right? And so that to me is the connect. That's why the gilded philanthropy doesn't work, because it's basically still propping up systems that in many ways have only become sort of more extreme, like especially the inequality, all of this philanthropy that's just kind of around the edges trying to hold up the system has brought us to this place where our systems are not holding up anymore because they need to be transformed. So that's the call for the new era, is that we need this new purpose, and we need it if we're going to try to meet this moment. And the good news is that it's not like a fiction. It's not something that we have to make up. But actually, for the last decade, I think there's been a new generation of leadership in philanthropy. And on the margins of the sector, we have been planting seeds of this new era. So I'm going to share with you some examples of what I think this new era looks like. So I see the new era emerging in foundations that are shifting power to grantees by offering long-term and flexible support. And in my book, I describe an effort from the Walter and Elise Haas Senior Fund, where they moved from 1-year grants to 7-year grants, right? So a 7-year grant makes possible a runway, it makes possible stability, it makes possible security, it makes possible a reality where grantees can continue to provide critical services to their communities, even in times of upheaval, like the ones that we are going through right now. So that for me is a new era practice. We see the new era emerging in foundations and boards that are spending towards purpose, not towards perpetuity. So the instinct and the practice to decide how much you're going to spend as a foundation from the vantage point of how can I exist forever, that is a gilded practice, because that is a practice that is prioritizing the preservation of your institution over transformation in our communities. So foundations that are starting to spend towards purpose and that are shifting their governance practices towards greater accountability, towards having people on their boards that have proximity to community, that come from community, those are new era practices. I see the new era emerging in funders that are investing in our democracy by investing in the communities that are most marginalized in our democracy. I see the new era emerging in funders who are accompanying social movements and walking alongside them, not dictating where those movements need to go and what they need to do, but instead walking alongside them and resourcing their needs. And just to say, that's one that I think is going to become much more important as we go through the next few months. So we have been, over the last decade, planting seeds of this new approach to philanthropy. Some of you might know it as trust-based philanthropy. And maybe you've experienced it and you've experienced the change through funders that are making their application process easier. Or maybe you've seen it through the removal of reporting requirements or the lessening. The fundamental part of the shift is that we are moving from centering the donors in that Carnegie type of model to centering what communities need. And I would say it's early days. Like, many of these changes have come about because of these times of crisis that we've been in over the last decade. And now we are in this moment, and as I've been talking to funders, I've been describing it as really a moment for choosing, right? So this new era that I talk about, it's not going to come about by default. It's only going to come about if funders and you all, which I'm going to get to, choose it and decide that this is going to be how we resource things. Because the default, if we're not intentional, the default will just be the gilded philanthropy. And if we fall back on that, then we miss this huge opportunity to put the $2 trillion that exist today and the 11.9 trillion that we're expecting to come into the sector, to really put that money towards a future where the public good is resourced and is not dependent upon private dollars. So I'm going to move now to your role, the fundraiser's role in building the new era. And I'll say that, the book is focused on the work of funders and the evolution of philanthropic practice. But the truth is that this new era is not going to be built by funders alone. You all play a critical role in the ecosystem, and you are working inside nonprofits and community-based organizations, and you are basically on the front lines of the relationship with philanthropy. So you're the bridge builders, you're the translators, you're the culture shapers. And I want to start by saying that you have more influence than you might realize. Many of the stories I tell in the book, and much of the work I've done as a funder to reimagine practice, to create and move towards trust-based approaches, it's been influenced by my conversations with fundraisers. It's been influenced by my own experience also trying to raise money, but who I listen to as a funder is the people that I sort of see myself working for, and that is grant seekers, and that is you all. So I'm going to take a moment and read a couple of pages from the book about an experience that I had as a grant seeker. And then I'm going to leave you all with 3 opportunities that I see for you, things you can bring into your work. So this section is from a chapter entitled Fund Complexity and Wholeness. And it is this chapter, this section heading is Not My Issue Will Be Our Downfall. In 2008, I was hired to lead the development of a new donor collaborative, the Rise Together Fund, to support organizations challenging post-9/11 Islamophobia. The 2 large foundations who initially launched the fund had program areas focused on human rights and national security. As a South Asian who had worked in the community, I understood Islamophobia as a racial justice issue and a threat to our democracy. As a collaborative fund, we were both a grant maker and a grant seeker. In my role raising resources, I would meet with prospective donors whose values I shared to invite them to support this cross-cutting and impactful work. A racial justice program officer would suggest that I speak with the immigration funders, and the immigration funders suggested that I talk to the democracy funders. In meeting after meeting, they listened to me explain the work and then apologetically responded, "It's really great work, Dimple. It just doesn't fit in my portfolio." Meanwhile, beyond philanthropy, conservatives were engaged in efforts to spread Islamophobia. Between 2010 and 2016, anti-Muslim activists introduced 194 bills in 39 state legislatures across the country to ban Sharia law from being considered in U.S. courts. A ballot measure in Kansas banning Sharia law passed by 70%. The far right was testing whether a drummed-up fear of Muslims could motivate the right, much like attacks on same-sex marriage in past years and anti-trans bills today. And in Kansas, they found their answer. In 2015, then-candidate Donald Trump announced that were he to become president, he would institute a total and complete shutdown of the country's borders to Muslims. The broader donor community had an opportunity to support a safer future for all of us, but had declined to act, unable to see past the program area they'd created. They saw this as an issue narrowly related to Islamophobia, rather than as a threat to pluralism and democracy itself. They underestimated how tied our fates are. They were program-aligned, but worldview agnostic. Many of us working in philanthropy recognize that we are in a moment when our democracy is under extreme threat. In 2023, more than 589 bills targeting the health and safety of trans kids and adults were introduced. The push to ban critical race theory has taken hold in states where people want to erase rather than acknowledge the country's racist history and its ongoing impacts. Political retaliation has become commonplace, as we saw when 2 Tennessee lawmakers were expelled from the state legislature for protesting against gun violence in the aftermath of a school shooting, or as we saw yesterday when my senator from the state of California was arrested. Conservative funders have worked in coordinated ways to move dollars and attention from one issue to the next, understanding that it's all part of the same fight. Will the broader donor community of donors and foundations understand the magnitude of these times and embrace a more expansive approach to funding that centers the work as it's experienced in communities? Or will they look back and say, we couldn't fight critical race theory because we didn't have an unban the books program area? We cared about kids being safe at school and surviving, but the foundation didn't have a healthy trans kids portfolio. We would have loved to have support urgent issue of the day, but our hands are tied with perceived time, geographic, or issue area constraint. It's especially important to uplift the long-term movement, power building, and other on-the-ground work led by organizers in communities that rarely fall neatly into funding priorities, because it is by definition and design intersectional. Community wisdom and lived experience tells us that issues are never singular and that power cannot be siloed. Thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm going to leave you with 3 pieces of advice on opportunities that I see for those of you who are doing the day-to-day work of fundraising, in terms of ways that you can show up that will help build this new era. So number 1, ask for what you actually need. And this is one that I offer from 20 years of being on the other side of the asks and seeing time and time again that fundraisers will come and ask for what they think you are able to give them without saying what they actually need. And it's a very human instinct that comes from wanting to appear reasonable. And I'm not saying don't be reasonable, but I think that what it does is over time, it actually keeps your funders in the dark about what it takes to truly do the work. And so what I would encourage you to do is, of course, ask for what they want you to ask for. But make sure that you, in your role, are communicating what you actually need. What's your bold vision? What's your big vision? What does it actually take to do this critical work, and do it sustainably, and do it in a way that centers care for your people, for your community, because you're kind of the main source of information that funders have. So when you come forward and you say, oh, we can solve hunger with this $50,000 grant, you're basically feeding into what is already this model of scarcity, right? The challenges that you all are working on, these are deep systemic challenges. There's actually something very powerful in being honest about the resources that are required to make the shifts that you're trying to make. And it's a step towards sustainability. I think we're seeing all across our nonprofit sector and community burnout, right? We're seeing leaders just kind of throw in the towel. They're exhausted. You might be exhausted. One thing that's at the root of that is that we have not been honest about what this work takes. So I invite you to share that as an expert. You are coming into the room as an expert on your organization, on the work you do, and on what's truly needed. My second offering for you is to lead with values before talking about issues. In the interviews that I conducted with grant seekers, one of the most common things I heard was the frustration about how hard it is to break out of the silo that your work has been put into. And the story that I just shared was kind of my own experience of, these like ridiculous silos and how hard it was to raise money for work that actually could have fit into any of those. I talked with a workers' rights organization that is trying to get their members green jobs. They're trying to basically move the workers that they organize into the green economy, get them jobs doing solar paneling. There's been an explosion in the resources that are available for climate funding. And they said to me, we just can't seem to get philanthropy to understand that we are a workers' rights organization that's doing climate-related work. And in fact, they shared with me the ways in which their program officers actually advised them not to try to jump silos, because they said, if you position yourself that way as a climate organization, we may not be able to fund you anymore as a workers' rights organization. And so I think that this is one where philanthropy and fundraisers have to work together to shift this norm. And I think the piece that is yours to do, and my advice to you, is to really lead with the values that are the foundation of the work that you're doing and the future that your organization is trying to build. And the issues that you work on are just the way that you're trying to get there. But the more that we can really lean into a broader frame that is about shared values, and I say the same thing to funders, the more then that we can hold lightly these really tight, limiting kind of issue silos and allow you all to get work that might fit many places, but you're being kind of told you have to fit into one place. My last piece of advice for you is I would ask you all to make sure that the work that you are doing in your organization is not running on timelines that are funder driven, but that your timelines for your work are being informed by the community. And by this, what I mean is, a grant might be a year long. Maybe you are lucky and you have a 2-year grant, and maybe your funder now wants to know, well, what can you accomplish in 2 years, right? And it's a very real tension. And oftentimes what an organization can accomplish in 2 years is something different than what you actually want to accomplish in 10 years. And with the magnitude of challenges that our communities face today, making sure that your organizations are working on that 10-year horizon or that 20-year horizon, that's the only way we actually get to the future that we started this talk with. And so I encourage you to not do the small work that can only happen in small timelines. In my book, I share a conversation I had with Mia Birdsong, who is doing this incredible work. It's like narrative change work that's trying to change how we understand the concept of freedom in our culture, and to move towards an understanding of interdependent freedom, freedom to be in community, freedom to take care of each other. She shared with me that when she gets a grant, her funders will ask her, what will you have to show for this 2 years from now or 3 years from now? And her response to her funders was, I can't answer that, because the work that I'm doing and putting into motion, it's gonna come to fruition long after I'm gone. This is 50-year work. This is generational work. And so I could give you an answer, but it's not going to be meaningful and it's not going to be true, because the kind of change that we need is generational change. And her experience was sharing that with the funders helped her funders understand that their demands were getting in the way of these more longer term approaches to work. So you may not all be in that position of being able to negotiate. Mia is a very, she's bold and I admire her courage in pushing back. So my ask is a little more nuanced, but it's that whatever you have to do with your funders, do it, but make sure that the work happening in your organization, that the timelines for it are not driven by funders. Make sure that the timelines are really driven by community need. So that's what I have for you all. And I'm really excited to hear your questions. I hope that the topics I've covered give you kind of a different way of understanding your work with philanthropy. And I thank you all for your attention. Oh, so sweet. Thank you. So I would love to take questions, and do we need to pass a mic around for questions, or? Yes, okay. All right, so.
Someone asked this during the networking, and I thought it was a really good question. And as someone who's starting in philanthropy, I'd like to know your take. What would you tell yourself on day one if you could go back and tell her, like something you've learned about working in philanthropy and nonprofits?
Oh, like, what would I tell myself 20 years ago?
Yeah.
That it can and should all be reimagined, and that like anything that is kind of well, this is how it's done. It's just, this is how it's done until we redo it. So, I mean, that's been my experience, is that every aspect of what we do in philanthropy can be changed and must be changed. I did a lot of work after the first Trump election in terms of both trying to understand and reimagine, how do foundations decide how much to spend? That was like when I first became a CEO of a private foundation, that was taught to me as the most fixed thing. It's, this is called a spending policy. And, foundations decide how much to spend by doing this mathematical formula. There's this percentage, and it's multiplied by, the 3-year rolling average of the value of the endowment. And, I was able to reimagine that because I looked at that and I thought, well, where does community needs come in? Where does what's happening in the world come in? You're telling me we decide how much to spend without thinking about our values and mission and what's at stake for them right now? And so I was able to basically offer a completely different way. And my foundation did it, and then other foundations started hearing about it. And then I wrote about it in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and that article came out in February of 2020. It was the first article that was written anywhere about how foundations decide how much to spend that was not written by an investment advisor. Because investment advisors used to write those articles, and they would always basically tell you not to spend because they make more money if you spend less, right? So it came out in February of 2020. And then the pandemic happened, and all of a sudden, all of these mainstream foundations from everywhere were like, oh, we have to spend more, or oh, we have to look at spending. And that article led to a pretty mainstream kind of re-examination of how foundations decide how much to spend. So that, to me, is an example of there was a rule, and it seemed really fixed, and everybody said, this is how it is. That's how it was until it wasn't. And so I think that this is what I always tell people who are coming into the field, bring all of your brilliance, bring all of your understanding of what communities need, bring your sense of urgency, and let's dream about how we do this differently.
Morning. So loved the Carnegie conversation. Here in Bellevue, we're in a cradle of wealth. This is also a very tech-heavy area. What would you say to Seattle's own Carnegie, Bill Gates?
It's so funny. I feel so I'm on this 6-week, today is the last day of 6 weeks of me being on the road. And for some reason, I think it's because I was coming to Seattle this week, every stop, people have asked me about Bill Gates. So I will tell you this. So in DC on Wednesday night, a woman stood up and said, Bill Gates really needs to read your book. And I said, I shared the story, which I have in the book, which is that before Bill Gates was a billionaire, actually I think probably before he was even a millionaire, when he first, a very young Bill Gates, first met Warren Buffett, Warren Buffett looked at him and said, oh, this guy's going to be somebody someday. He apparently could kind of see that the trajectory he was on. So he gifted him the gospel of wealth. I mean, that's like an actual thing. And so that woman who asked me that question in DC, she came up afterwards, she bought a book, and she handed it to me and said, I'm going to get this book to Bill Gates. So will you write him a message? And so I did. We'll see. But, you know, I think the thing I would give Gates credit for is and I probably didn't in this talk give Carnegie enough credit for this. You know, one of the things that Carnegie said that no one listened to in the Gospel of Wealth is he said, we should spend this money in our lifetime. And that is, it's so interesting that so much of the other kind of really awful, like, billionaires are better than anybody stuff has been taken up. But then that one piece that where he kind of says, I think his phrase is something like, you know, it's like, it's a sin to die wealthy, right? So that's something that I feel like Bill Gates is trying to aspire to. We'll see if he gets there. But the thing I would say to Bill Gates is that spending down in your lifetime, you know, the spend down, that in and of itself is not the thing to be proud of. Because if you are spending down, but the decision makers is still just you, then you're basically still exercising all the control. You're just doing it faster, you know? Like, so, but there's not really like a shift in power. So in the book, I talk about an example from the UK context of a foundation that made some really profound shifts in their governance and had community members come onto their board and not just come onto their board, but really come on and have real power. And after being around for 60 years, because of those governance shifts, this foundation announced that they were moving all of their capital into community control. Not spending down, not just making all the decisions faster, but actually giving over the resources to community organizations so that the community organizations could decide what they thought was best. And so, I mean, in this moment where the Gates Foundation has announced this, you know, time frame, I think it's a moment of such opportunity for them to actually, you know, not live out the gilded fantasy, but to use this capital, this tremendous amount of capital, in ways that are transformative.
If you're familiar with the Meet the Moment pledge, or if you're not, just your general knowledge.
The trust-based philanthropy, yeah.
What do you think is the most exciting thing in that pledge, and what do you think is the most critical thing that's missing from that pledge?
I think what's probably exciting about it is that I think at this point they've had over 300 funders sign on to it. I've been involved with trust-based philanthropy before the project existed and have served on the steering committee and so on. And I have like a little bit of a strategic kind of critique of the pledge, which is that it has so many things that you can do that I feel like there's not just one thing. So that if I were to myself write a Meet the Moment pledge, what I would write is just put more resources out in the world. That's it. Like, the rest of it is okay, but I'm uncomfortable with the fact that funders can sign on to it without actually committing that they're going to increase their payout. And from my talk from talking to people in the field who are trying to raise money right now, the resources aren't flowing. So I feel like it concerns me because I don't want somebody patting themselves on the back saying like, we've agreed to meet the moment, we took the pledge, but then they're not increasing the resources. And I think right now, in my community in the Bay Area, organizations that have been flourishing in recent years are laying people off, and it's avoidable. It's not that the money doesn't exist. It's that the sector isn't working in the ways that it should and isn't moving the resources out of our endowments and into community when it's most needed. So I would simplify it. I would say, like, to meet the moment right now, at a minimum, every funder should be increasing their payout. There's nothing that any funder's working on that's not on fire right now. So the idea that you're like, oh, we changed our reporting requirements, it's like, that's not enough. You should have done that anyway. Yeah.
Thank you, Dimple, for the thoughtful conversation, giving us all that historical context and then helping us to reimagine this new era. As you have just recently concluded your big book tour all across the country, have there been any standout moments for you or impressions that were left that are going to help you as you move towards the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I have been noticing that funders are overwhelmed and frozen. And I know I feel a little bit odd saying that in a room of people who are fundraisers, because I think your job right now is so difficult. I have a section in the book that I somewhat, almost instinctively and spontaneously read at one of my early book talks, and it's about how in 2020 I started to notice what looked a little bit like vicarious trauma amongst kind of my own funding colleagues as we had moved towards a more relational way of funding. Basically, starting in 2017, we had moved towards doing phone calls instead of written reports. And, I started to see kind of, my colleagues who were spending all day on the phone with grantees, at the end of the day, they just were overwhelmed and would come into my office and say, I talked to 3 different grantees who broke down in tears today at how bad things are in their community and how what a struggle it is. And my own background is I'm trained as a lawyer, and I spent part of my career doing frontline free civil legal services. And in that context, we would be trained up on noticing vicarious trauma and noticing how it makes you kind of shut down and just not want to do your work, right? And when I first moved into philanthropy, you never would have seen that, because the whole framework for philanthropy was that, when you work in philanthropy, you're at they would use this phrase, you're at the 30,000 foot view, you're way up here and the people doing the work are way down here. And so what I write about in the book is that I think part of the new era is that we've really been shifting that, nobody's way up here anymore, but we're actually networked and we're in proximate relationship if we're doing this work right. And so then we need to actually understand and take responsibility for how that's impacting us, right? So I have actually seen, I wrote that piece and I shared it at an early reading, and I had this woman come up to me in tears after. She worked at a huge foundation, and she said, I haven't known what's been happening with me, but when you read that, I just thought, that's me. And she was like, I can't, my inbox is full, my voicemail is full. And it turned out that her role at this big foundation was that she was their special initiatives person. So everything that didn't have a home would come to her. And she said, I'm just frozen. And so for a while, I started just like reading that in spaces because I was thinking like, she was almost in tears, but there were other people who came up and they were like, you're saying something that needs to be said. And so it's helped me kind of understand that some of what looks like lack of responsiveness is like a deep overwhelm, So that's one thing. And that I think it's important to have compassion for that. I think what I'm hearing from funders is that there's never been as much incoming at them as there is right now. And they don't necessarily feel like they have the tools to respond, or they're also not necessarily always getting like a whole new portfolio of money, So that's one piece. I will share one other thing. Before the book came out, I had the opportunity to pilot like the first 4 chapters with a community of self-described, they call themselves high-profile donors. So they're all like names that you would know. And they read the first 4 chapters and then brought me on to do a Zoom call with them. And that was fascinating because that's like people who have been longtime donors, who are people with tons of wealth. Some of them are known for their philanthropy. And what they said to me was, wow, this Carnegie story blew my mind. And so it was really interesting how it wasn't just me who didn't have that historical perspective, but that like even some of our, really high profile donors have not actually kind of gone deep into what they've inherited. And that phrase, the gilded philanthropy, and then what I offer as an alternative in the book is the idea of alchemy. So gilded philanthropy is like, we're just covering things over, right, with our philanthropy. Alchemy is the idea that we take these resources and we try to turn them into something else, right? So that the process is about transformation. So what I heard from these donors is that was like a really sticky idea, which was great. Yeah. And I feel like a sponge. I've just been soaking in all these things I'm hearing. Yeah? Okay. Thank you all so much.